Welcome. This is a session on identity in global development and kind of looking at the situation of identity, and particularly the issue of legal identity all over the world. My name is Niall McCann. I work with the United Nations Development Programme in New York, and I'm joined on this panel with four wonderful leading women professionals in their field, by Vyjayanti Desai, who's the project manager with the ID for Development Programme in the World Bank, by Kyla Reid from GSMA, by Dakota Gruener, executive director in ID 2020, and by Rebeca Omaña from the Organization of American States. And we have about 45 minutes on this session, so let's just kick things off. First of all, let me just introduce myself and why is a guy whose title is Elections Advisor on a panel such as this, or chairing a panel like this. Well, UNDP, where I work, is the UN's development agency, main development agency, and a number of countries come to the UN every year, actually, usually about 30 countries, and ask for some help in organising their own elections for various reasons. In a number of countries in the last few years, we have assisted countries develop biometric voter registration systems because they've wanted those for various reasons. And there's a session on Wednesday on voter registration that I'll be speaking on always. But as we have helped some countries roll out voter registration systems using biometric technology, a number of those same countries, or indeed other countries, have said, you know what, actually, maybe it's better if we try and do a national identity card scheme. Maybe let's establish a national identity register. Let's try and update and upgrade and introduce digital technologies into our system for registering our populations. Let's move beyond the paper-based civil registers that we've had for decades or even hundreds of years, and let's try and embrace new technology to register all of our citizens and indeed foreigners. Let's take biometric data. Let's establish these type of comprehensive identity registers, possibly with an independent authority like a National Registration Bureau or a National Identity Authority managing that system. And in being asked to do that kind of thing, we are obviously in UNDP facing a number of the major policy issues that I think have already been referenced in some of the comments made this morning by Edward Snowden. There's all of these issues with regards to privacy, with data protection, with the role of biometrics in public administration, with matters related to how do you reconcile the fact that old paper-based civil registers establishing people's presence going back hundreds of years, how can that now interact with new digital systems of identifying people? If countries, for example, roll out national identity registers or issue national ID cards, in effect, if there's no way to digitize old paper records, are we in effect starting then from a year zero type situation where we had paper up until now, we have digital going forward? And what is the legal primacy of paper data versus digital data, for example? If I'm able to produce a birth certificate that I was given 46 years ago, that's tattered and crumpled and there's no photograph and everything, how can in fact any identity authority these days be sure that that is in fact the birth cert that was issued to me? These are just some of the policy issues that we're all facing. So I think, just to kick this off, one of the statistics that was mentioned this morning was the fact that there's still, I believe the figure now, Vyjayanti can correct me, is 1.2 billion people in the world still with no legal identity, meaning in effect they are not able to prove who they are. They have possibly never been issued with any form of identity credential. Perhaps their birth was never registered. Perhaps they used to have identity documents but have since lost them. So they're not able to prove who they are. And obviously then that can lead to this downward level of spiral of vulnerability, not being able to gain secure employment, not being able to open bank accounts, not being able to access education, health, welfare services, not being able to get passports, not being able to gain additional identity documents because of a lack of a base identity credential in the form of a birth cert or whatever, because of the fact that their birth might have never been recorded. Let's just start with Vyjayanti. Vyjayanti, why are we in this situation still where we have over 1 billion people who are not able to prove who they are? What are the major challenges that countries faced in trying to document and identify their citizens?
Thanks, Niall. And yes, you're correct. The 1.2 billion figure is actually the recent update from our annual data set. 1.5 billion is what we had last year. And I think what we've done, we've looked at across 25 different countries and looked at assessments, and we see common challenges that emerge as to why we still see this number. And I think it falls into four large buckets. I think one is on governance. There's still, in many countries, a fragmented system. So you see in several countries in Africa, up to even 15 different identification systems. In Nigeria alone, we estimate that about $4 billion could have been saved by having a more a comprehensive approach to identification. You see also civil registries, as you said, and ID systems not necessarily being linked together. I think on the technology, we still see in over half the countries paper-based systems, legacy paper-based systems, and we hear from countries that are enduring civil war that oftentimes it just is eradicated. Or in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, we heard that it was infested with termites, and so the information is irreplaceable. And then when countries have gone into more digital forms of identifications, we've seen issues of vendor lock-in, getting sucked into proprietary technology, and countries unable to really emerge from that. There's also legal and regulatory frameworks. I think there's about only a half or so that have some form of privacy, data protection laws, and in those even it's not fully enforced. And then issues of cost, both indirect and direct, so just the cost of being able to access and get registered. In Botswana, for example, a third of the kids who are unregistered is partly because just of the distance to the nearest registration center. So these are sort of broad categories of issues that we see emerging from the work that we do. I think, I don't know if you want us to talk about what we are doing.
Yeah, what's the response then of the ID for Development program, the World Bank?
Given that we're a development organization, about 2.5, 3 years ago, there was a commitment to embark on this identification for development effort because we see it as a key enabler for so many different development outcomes, whether it's health, financial inclusion, more effective targeting of our social safety net programs. And so we have across the globe sort of three pillars of work. One is on the country engagement. So as I mentioned, we've done about 20, 25 so assessments, which have led to sort of a portfolio about 12 countries now with about $500 million of work that we're supporting countries with a pipeline of an additional 500 million or so. For example, in Morocco, providing support to the country in terms of providing a unique identification system, a national population registry that can then be linked also to social safety net programs, for example, a health insurance for the poor program, or a conditional cash transfer program to get poorer families to send their kids to school. So that's one example. There's such as in Uganda, we're supporting the civil registration system. So that's at the country level. We're also working at the regional level because we realize that increasingly identification is portable. People migrate across very seamless borders. And rather than approaching it from a country-by-country system, can we work with a number of different countries, maybe sub-regionally at first, so that we just don't, we approach it from a very practical perspective, both with West Africa and East Africa, looking at systems of mutual recognition. So not necessarily that each country has to have the same identification system, but there's a form of mutual recognition. And so that's another example of the work. I think the second and third pillar, with the support of Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're able to do more analytic work, for example, the link of identification in a number of different development outcomes, such as health, financial inclusion, looking at issues of fiscal savings. If people need to invest in this, what are the fiscal savings, both from a government perspective, but also from a private sector perspective. Looking at new emerging technologies, because we have to be ahead of the curve. We don't want to be supporting countries with systems of the past, but what are the new emerging technologies? And there's other analytic work that's all available publicly on our website. And then there's the issue of convening. So, for example, I think a good number of us have endorsed the principles of identification because we felt it was critical to have a common vision across the different development partners, but also foundations, UN agencies, private sector associations, in understanding what are the key elements, the 10 principles that we think are core. So that's an example of the work that we also do on more of the advocacy and convening.
Great, thanks. Rebecca, if you look at this Organization of American States region, this 34 member states headquarters here in Washington, are some of the challenges that Vyjayanti identified, are they recognizable to you? And do you think there's additional challenges or other challenges that weren't mentioned that are faced in the Americas region?
Yes, thank you, Niall. The challenges are very similar to what Vyjayanti was just mentioned. The organization members are 34 member states, independent states. It's a very diverse group. We have countries with universal registration, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Costa Rica, and we have other countries where we still have rates in the 20% for children under 5. So the diversity of the region is amazing. We have very technological advanced systems and other that are not so much, that are still paper-based. So we have to deal with trying to focus on getting to the goal of zero under registration, but understanding the difference between the countries. So as an organization, what we are doing is basically 3 things. First, we are a political organization, so we work with mandates, and the good thing is like the 34 countries consider universal registration and identification as an important goal. So last year, following the example of Asia and Africa, we have our first ministerial meeting, and ministers, different kind of ministers, agree on putting resources and political will to advance the goal. The second thing that we do is technical cooperation, and we do it with different countries in different kind of projects, from digitalizing registries to mobile campaigns in border areas, to putting offices in hospitals to make available registration to newborns. The third thing that we are really focusing on is we are the executive secretariat of the Regional Council of Civil Registries. So we are working with them. There are 20 members, and they are trying to find solutions, regional solutions to problems like verification of information for security reasons. In the case of Central America, there is a migration corridor that is very important for them. So we are providing technical assistance, but more advice capacity to the council to find regional responses to the problems. Okay,
great, thanks. Kyla, let me come to you. The Vyjayanti mentioned the concept of portable identity and the identity, or the possibility that various different countries in a region might be able to recognize, be it ID cards or whatever issued by other countries in that region. Clearly, mobile technology has a role to play in this, a strong role to play. Are there other challenges that you see in broaching or solving the world's identity gap? And if so, what role can mobile technology play in closing that gap?
So I think the decision on what constitutes a legal identity in a particular country is really the purview for governments and their citizens to establish. But I think our perspective at the GSMA is that private sector and mobile technology in particular can really help accelerate and drive demand for these identity documents. So we know that in over 90 countries in the world, in order to even register and make a phone call, you need to provide a proof of official identity. So it's really becoming a demand driver for some of these nationally led systems. But I think one of the things that we have to think about is that it's not just getting these ID documents, whether they're mobile or smart cards or paper-based systems, into the hands of citizens, but really creating an ecosystem where that ID links to services. And I think that's where the private sector has a special role to play in terms of building on top of these systems and using it to offer identity-linked services, such as financial services, such as mobile services, and really helping build out, the infrastructure that can help put the rails in. So we're seeing some really exciting developments already, particularly linked to the SDGs and the development agenda, where mobile technology is having a really transformative role. And one of those areas is in civil registration and vital statistics. So a number of mobile operators around the world are now investing in something called mobile or digital-based birth registration. And we're seeing this in countries like Ghana, in Tanzania, and Pakistan, where the acceleration of birth registration has increased up to threefold in a very short period of time because this registration process is now being offered through mobile. And mobile operators have agent networks, they have customer face-to-face experiences, so they can use this infrastructure and these assets to help accelerate the enrollment and registration process. So in Pakistan, I think previously to get registered at birth, it was 3 trips to a government office. It was at least 2 weeks between making that first appointment and receiving the certificate, and now it's down to a 10-minute process. And we're seeing similar gains in terms of efficiency and access in other countries as well. So I think that's a particular area where we see transformative potential, but that's only one of many examples that we expect will grow. And I think one of the other things that we have to consider, in addition to creating the ecosystem of services around this identity, is also the sort of sequencing and harmonization of identity-related policies. So in countries where they've linked national ID to solving for your customer requirements, there's been a massive uptake in mobile financial services leading on to a financial inclusion agenda. So I think if we think about this not only as let's ensure that everyone has access to a legal identity, but how do we actually create a holistic system where people can get utility and value out of those services in a seamless way, we'll see a much greater impact.
Thanks. Dakota, how does ID 2020 view this entire issue? And are there additional challenges that you think that an organization like yourselves can play in helping to solve this gap?
Sure. Well, I just want to layer quickly onto what Kyla just said, because I think it's a really important piece, which is saying that we need to create an ecosystem around this, because identity has intrinsic value, but it's also a matter of what rights you can access and how you can move through society as a result of being able to prove who you are. And so what's critical in that is that there is this landscape of people, including lots of the organizations that we see in this room, who for a long time have been solving for sort of the identity challenges that you or I may confront in wandering around New York or DC. And that conversation and this conversation have existed somewhat in parallel tracks. And so I'm really partially just enthused to see the convergence of the conversation here, all of the sort of technical best practices that are on display. Because I think what it does is say that there are solutions in this room that we can bring to the conversation that we're having about sort of the challenge globally. And I think that one of the sort of key things that we see in the challenge is that we believe that lack of identification is to some extent a market failure. And what I mean by that, and I think actually both of you touched upon this, Vyjayanti and Niall, in your opening remarks, was that at the moment we have a lot of funding being directed into programs that almost by design don't interoperate. And these are programs with the absolute best intentions in the world, but Niall, when you describe being asked to come in and set up a biometric voter registration campaign, that's a critical and sort of short-term need, but that's money that goes into, we're going to set up a voter registration campaign, not into a repeat use identification system that's of utility to the individuals, and you can sort of live with somebody, be persistent, be portable, et cetera. And so without that sort of mechanism for coordination, what we see is these investments result in sort of lower coverage rates, because if you're only canvassing voters, for example, you're not canvassing children. You have a loss of record continuity because that voter registration is not relevant for something else. And then of course there's inefficiencies in the way that money is spent. And so I think what we see is that you need a mechanism for coordination, both so that you can figure out how you incentivize investments in repeat use systems. And I think that's sort of where essentially following the dollar really matters, so that donor funds get used for systems that are repeat use, but also because if you have that mechanism for coordination, you can start having a lot of the really, really thorny conversations around ideas of security and privacy, et cetera. I think the points that Edward Snowden made this morning are so important in that there are these really big philosophical conversations that we need to be having, and we need to be having them with all of the stakeholders around the table. And so until we sort of create that table, we're sort of going to be operating in sort of fits and starts.
Okay, well, look, there's about 2 or 3 questions that I'm going to ask for everyone to jump in on. Then we'll certainly leave time in the end for questions to come from the floor. But one I think, frustration my organization faces is that as a development agency dealing with governments, we work in areas of, as you said, voter registration and now potentially national identity cards. You've got the largest, second largest or third largest UN body, which is UNICEF, helping countries work on birth registration and registering children, but in effect when children hit 16 years and beyond, then UNICEF has lost interest with them. We have the UN Population Fund that helps countries do census, help countries do demographic analysis, maybe some campaigning around against child marriage, etc. But that's their focus. We have the Refugee Agency that works with refugees, so they're not really interested in any other population registration type activity. I think the point is that the entire international development assistance industry is almost set up to be working in silos, working with countries on specific individual registrations of populations. And is it simply to be deduced at this point? Or can we all agree that actually the reality, or what we should be doing, is in effect working with countries to develop holistic birth-to-death type identity ecosystems, where there is sort of one base official identity that is government granted from birth and then follows them for the rest of their life? Because we've seen even this morning with some of the comments from Ed Snowden, one of the problems with that, if that is the case, is that if you lump all of someone's official identity into sort of one structure and one system, there is a risk then, the single point of failure risk, whereby if that identity becomes compromised in whatever way, then or an individual escaping that identity failure could be a massive, massive challenge that could follow them for years to come. Any thoughts initially on this one?
I can add to that. I think that's partly why, as part of the World Bank Group efforts, and I think as the engagement with so many development partners, I think we're increasingly moving towards a conversation of a foundational identification system that can serve various program-specific or functional purposes. But that doesn't mean that that foundational identification system has to be a massive central database that collects all the information needed for all the functional purposes. If you have a foundational system that has minimal data, that provides a unique identifier from birth to death, as you say, that can then be in decentralized registries for various purposes, that's certainly, I think, one step in the right direction. I think with emerging technology, we'll see other forms of decentralized approaches that could emerge as well. But I certainly don't think that the systems of the past have succeeded, where huge amounts of either donor or government resources or private sector resources have been invested into 15 to 20 separate siloed identification systems. And I think one of the challenges with that is you never reach full coverage. You never have universality. Mm-hmm. So you have always the marginalized who will be excluded, or the women or children who will be excluded. And I think there needs to be more intentionality in that approach.
If I can add to what Vyjayanti just said, we see this in our region. We are looking at many countries going to unique identifier numbers from birth to death, but we have very complex laws in some of the countries. So, for example, the OES has invested a lot of resources and time in Haiti to help them build an identification system that didn't exist before 2005. So it was created for electoral reasons, but after it became the identification system that is used for all kind of activities for the citizens. But in Haiti right now, today, we still have 3 institutions working in identity and identification. So you have the Civil Registry, you have the Office of National Identification, and you have the National Archive. So if you want a copy of your birth certificate, you don't go to the Civil Registry. You need to get one from the National Archives. So that is something that we have to deal with, because the only way to change it is through legislation. And it has been a very long way to try to modernize legislation to have a more cohesive system. We are still working with federal governments where you have different states, and registration is a federal it's a federal activity at the local level, but identification is centralized in one institution. So, yes, I think the goal is to try to work in connecting all these systems to try to provide better services, to have a more secure system.
I think maybe one thing to add on top of the policy frameworks and the sort of technological interoperability of the systems is this friction on the user journey. So you've described that a little bit, but we hear that if you're a refugee or a forcibly displaced person, you have to go through at least 7 different registration discussions with different agencies in order to get access to services, and you're having the same conversation with a person from a different agency for a similar service. And from an end user perspective, the incentive structure and the experience is obviously quite poor. So how can we collectively agree on a minimum set of attributes that then can be added to for different purposes, whether those are services offered by public or private sector? And I think that's when we start talking about levels of assurance and what do I need to know about somebody in order to provide a certain kind of service? What is the user perspective going to be around the trust and willingness to share that information in receipt for a particular kind of service? And that will depend on who's providing it and how they value the utility. So I think it's an area that requires a lot of further research, particularly when we're talking about the development context, because we don't know as much about what people's expectations and preferences are for these kinds of both services and the identity experience. So we've been doing some research in Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania and Pakistan to try and get a sense of how can technology help address this problem? What are people's perspectives around identity? Equally importantly, how are they getting around not having identity now? Because there are winners and losers. And how can we create the right incentives and understand user behavior and preferences to ensure that services are designed and are fit for purpose and for behavior and attitudes that we find amongst populations who are the most likely to be excluded? And I think that's a really important area that requires further attention.
Yeah. Just one kind of additional point on that. So I think, we as everyone else on the panel believe that the state has a critical role in providing legal identity. But I think one of the things that we think is important is sort of imagining that is one of many credentials that people may have. And so, certainly to Vyjayanti's point, minimal sort of data ownership in any database, I think, is an important thing. Sort of to Niall's question about risks of potential misuse in a single point of failure. But I think if you're saying that there's sort of you have multiple credentials by multiple sort of issuing parties, and you end up with sort of multiple personas as a result. If you can create a user-centric model where that individual, whether that's a refugee who's suddenly sort of maybe less inclined to trust the government from which they're fleeing, or somebody just moving about their day-to-day life, that allows you to very selectively disclose what information you think is relevant for an organization to know about you. And so it puts the user back in control, the individual back in control of their own data.
Well, let's go to this issue of the role of the nation state and whether there are any kind of alternatives to either supplement existing state-run systems or to be actual alternatives to state-run systems. Identity has always been something granted. Official or legal identity has always been something granted by governments to people. If your birth is not registered, if you have not been issued with an identity credential, you don't legally exist. You're one of these 1.2 billion people in the world that doesn't.
The modern nation-state system, it has not always
Well, I think we're agreeing that this is the point. If
said it's always been that way, and it's not.
perhaps, I think we can agree that when governments do not fulfill their responsibility to register people, either through their birth or to grant them identity credentials beyond that, then the government is failing in its responsibility. I think that's for sure.
Just say that. Don't say always. Like, it's
Okay,
always
okay,
been
point.
that way. It's modern nation states created the system.
Okay, fair enough. But in the self-assertion or in this move or desire for people to have more control over their identity data moving forward, with people's ability to assert their identities online in perhaps ways that nation states have not necessarily recognized in the past, can we arrive at a point, do you think, where people have such control over their own identity data that they are able to have it officially recognized by nation states, by governments, elements that those nation states may not necessarily want to recognize? Can we ever imagine a situation where someone is so in charge of their own identity that they're able to change elements of their identity as recorded by the state in a way that the state may not necessarily have been happy with? I'm thinking, for example, of things like gender identity or as someone asserting an ethnic identity that is extremely important to them that the state may not recognize or may not ever have recognized or want to recognize.
I can jump in quickly. So first, I want to say I really like the way you pose the question, because I think it makes an incredibly valuable point that this is not necessarily a binary, right? There's an opportunity potentially for these regional or global initiatives to supplement state-managed identity, not to replace them. Because I don't think we're not gonna come to a world where suddenly governments say, like, I don't want to play a role in doing something that, whether for the last 100 years or always, has something been central to sort of their piece in society. I think this goes back to the question that we made at the beginning of saying, there's identity in a the sort of state-centric notion of it, and then there is identity as a means of accessing goods and services and rights. And if you need, if the right that you're trying to access is voting, for example, the country is going to get to be the person who decides whether or not you are allowed to vote. However, if it's do we need to know this customer to be able to bank them, or do we need to, do we want to ensure that they get a vaccine that they're eligible or something, where that is not the necessary sort of constituent information, then you can imagine somebody being able to use sort of state-granted pieces of information to say, look, you have a good understanding of who I am. I'm a unique individual, and I'm over 18 or whatever the fact may be, and as a result, you can access that service with that right.
Mm-hmm. Just to add to that, I think there's also potential where it doesn't have to be necessarily government issued, but government recognized forms of identification. And I think this goes to also Kyla's point of the levels of assurance. And I think, Dakota, you made that point as well. If it's for, walking into to receive some, walking to a bar, for example, nobody needs to know anything other than the fact that you are over the age that you are. Whereas if you're entitled to certain government subsidies, I think that level of assurance, and if government's going to be providing cash transfers to you as an individual, I think that's a higher level of assurance that's required. So I think we need to disentangle some of these, and I worry in this world of the term digital identification that people are mixing things up, because I think at least from a development agency perspective, we're talking about a foundational form of identification that can leapfrog using digital forms, rather than a derivative form of your foundational identification. Like, this is not more of a convenience issue. It's, for those people who have no proof of identification, it's providing that, leveraging the new technologies. And I think we do need to disentangle these two issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, folks, let's open it up. Are there any questions from the floor? Are there any microphones?
Hi, I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little about the unique problems of refugees and migrants who... Just wanted to add... Oh, sorry. Just wanted to ask if you could talk a little about the unique problems of refugees and migrants who very often don't have digital identity or any other identity that they can use.
I can offer a very narrow example and then maybe hand it over to somebody else to give a broader perspective. But one of the things that we've discovered very recently at the GSMA is that because of this burden of proof of identification to register for a SIM card, in many countries, refugees are being disproportionately excluded. And I think we all see the headlines when it says, mobile is a lifeline for refugees. It is the way that people connect back with family. They get information. It's helping them navigate their journeys. And then we're seeing, as this policy of mandatory SIM registration is actively enforced, only 4 out of 20 countries that have the highest refugee hosting burden actually accept a UNHCR ID as adequate proof to register for a mobile phone. So that means that, we're really potentially limiting access to what is a critical service for an already marginalized and vulnerable group of people. So I think there is this, again, sort of policy and sequencing asymmetry that disproportionately impacts groups like refugees and forcibly displaced people because they don't have a recognized proof of identity. So that's a very specific example, but I think it has very significant impacts on the potential for service delivery and for things like access to communication, access to digital financial services, mobile remittances, and a number of the kinds of services that this group would particularly benefit from and depend on.
I'll add just a very little bit, and I think this is pretty obvious, but I think there's, refugees are an interesting group to think about in this, because you can't sort of go to the usual models of, support to a sovereign nation state to say, great, you guys are going to solve this for that, for this population. And so it sort of provokes a lot of the philosophical questions that I think that we need to be having around, how do we ensure that these people have sufficient ability to prove who they are to be able to access the goods and services necessary, particularly in a situation where there isn't then a government that you're sort of using as a direct point of access.
I can talk about the experience in the Americas. We have obviously different things going on, but in the case of Central America, you are in a migrant corridor to the U.S. So basically, we are working with the civil registries and identification bodies there to first try to put physical offices in border crossings, so between Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, so people can have access to documents close to the border in case that they lost documents and they need the protections of their states. That is the first thing that we are doing. We are working with them in interoperability for verification purposes. So sometimes it's very important for the countries to know if somebody that says that is Guatemalan is really Guatemalan or is not. So we are working in those systems for them not to share information, but to verify that a person is a citizen of the country that it says that it is. The other main thing that we have is migration in the Caribbean. We have a huge migrant population between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, for example. There is approximately 400,000 Haitian citizens living in the Dominican Republic. Around 200,000 of those don't have identity documents from Haiti. So we are working with both governments to provide identity and identification documents to the migrants in the DR for them to be able to have a regular status in the Dominican Republic, but at the same time to have the protections of their state if they decide to go back to Haiti. That is some of the examples.
Another question, gentleman behind?
All right.
Did we take that? Okay, let's take that gentleman first while he has the mic, and then we'll pass it to you, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Talking about one world identities, I want to go back to your last question. When who should be in control? The country or the individual? Of one's identity. Because right now, even when we talk about national identities like the passports or state ID cards, the governments own those identities. So when do we as individuals have our identities and are in control of those identities? Thank you.
Who wants that?
Well, I'll go for it. I think that first let's distinguish between identities and credentials. So I think a government has issued a credential, which is sort of an attestation of this person is a citizen of this country, and here's information about them. And I think if we can sort of disambiguate the two, you can imagine a world in which the government continues to be the owner of that credential, right? They can rescind citizenship if they want to or not, but the identity can be owned by the individual.
Sir?
Thank you. My name is Niall Wasserman from TimeWave Analytics. I just wanted to raise the flip side of secure identity that was, I think, suggested by the themes of Edward Snowden this morning. We're interested in applications to healthcare, patient access to data and services and things like that. In many global environments, the opportunity is not necessarily identifying the patient, but allowing the patient to identify themselves in an anonymized environment. They don't want to raise their hand and say, I have AIDS, in an environment where that kind of information is taboo in the culture, but services can still be delivered in an anonymized environment with the proper infrastructure. Can you say something to that opportunity to relate control of access to the patient's identity from a public standpoint, but still provide connection to those individuals?
So I'll have a better answer in a few months when we're actually looking at this issue together with WHO and CDC and the issue of unique identification and healthcare. But I think one of the big issues is being able to. So I think it's that the balance between not giving up your privacy and giving up information, but at the same time, how do programs and various services able to treat individuals effectively if they aren't able to track sort of the patient care, sort of that longitudinal patient care. So I think that these are things that are not easy. There's no single solution to it, but I do think that this is important both from a healthcare use angle as well as balancing it with privacy. But I don't think anybody would assume that your individual information. I think it goes to the issue of you don't have to have a centralized database of information if you have an ability to uniquely identify somebody without information on their actual health information, in that you're able to achieve both. But we'll have a better answer for you shortly. We're looking at a number of different countries and how this has been accomplished, and also what we can do going forward.
Any more questions? Lady here.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about the problem, because we all agree that it's a bit of a mess in emerging and developing countries. But what really fundamentally is the issue? Is it that there's a lack of money and investment, maybe because there's a lack of awareness among governments and others who do this? Is it because of a lack of leadership, either among agencies because they're siloed, or government leaders themselves because they don't really see where's the problem, what's the problem? Or is it just the technology itself, because it hasn't evolved to a point where people can use it easily, or it's cheap enough, or whatever?
I think in our observation, it's a combination of all of the above. I think, it's so fascinating to me that in 2017, finally this topic has become part of a global discussion. But really, until the Sustainable Development Goals were established, and 16.9 whipped up this frenzy of, there is this massive identity gap, and what are we all going to do about it? It was really something that I think was taken for granted. So I think we're at this sort of stage now where different organizations are saying, we've created these parallel identification systems or investments for governments to build these identification systems, and we haven't really rationalized what some of the very elemental factors of those are, either from a technology and interoperability perspective or from a principles and standards perspective. So I think we're just starting to see some of these thorny questions being asked and answered, and I think the principles that Vyjayanti referenced are a good sort of starting point to get different stakeholders around the table. I think we're seeing an increasing recognition that 1.2 billion people is a lot of people, and that governments themselves are not going to be able to address this challenge. We live now in a world where, 500 million people across Africa have a mobile phone in their pocket. So can we think more creatively about building systems that support integration, that enable private sector to help deliver either some of the services or processes that can accelerate and extend this technology? But I think the partnership model and the business case around who does what and what their role is still sort of being defined. And some of the work that we're doing at the GSMA now is to try and create proof of concept and demonstration of where that's working well. And I referenced the mobile birth registration example, but long-term sustainability of that from a financial perspective is still ambiguous. And I think the challenge with this topic is that it isn't confined to one sort of stage. The identity journey is very much a life cycle, and it's a very complicated topic, both in terms of defining what the return on investment is, managing the different competing political agendas, and it's a long-term play. So I think we're very much at the beginning of the journey, and it's great that it does have this spotlight on it, because there is such a dependency for so many other services, either in the digital or analog world, to run off being able to establish uniquely who somebody is.
I want to add, it's a combination of factors. I can talk about Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2008, the registration rate was around 18%. Right now, it's around 6%. That means 3.2 million children without a registration, and a number of adults that we don't exactly know. The problem now is the most vulnerable are the ones that lack registration, and they are the most difficult to find and to register. They are in the most isolated geographical areas. They are from indigenous or Afro-descendant populations. So the resources that the states have to use to find these people are a lot. And the region, because it's in a better place than other parts of the world, Africa or Asia, and in some countries, is looking at a lack of resources from financial institutions or cooperation agencies. So we have to deal with a low number that is difficult to find and with less resources.
I think just sort of one additional thought tying together both of those. I think Kyla's point that we need to sort of be thinking very creatively about where we meet people and where they are is really, really important. And it's actually why I'm so enthused about this, because, while the folks that, the individuals who aren't yet identified are, sort of almost by definition, the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, et cetera, we are reaching them through some services. So, for example, we vaccinate vastly more children now than we provide birth registrations to. If we can figure out how to use that as an entry point, suddenly you have a way to leverage an existing delivery network, and particularly to reach children when they're very young, such that they have something that can be sort of persistent with them through, sort of throughout life.
That's point, Vyjayanti.
Yeah, no, I think, some of the issues that I mentioned at the beginning of the challenges, looking at across about a third of Africa and increasingly in Asia, the challenges are consistent. And so I'm not going to repeat those. And I don't think there's any one particular, but we also know what's worked and what we can hope to achieve and reach this and close the gap. I think one is clearly leadership, as you mentioned. When we've seen the countries that have achieved almost universal coverage, there's been very strong leadership from the top. to ensure a more cohesive approach. I think linking to the demand side uses, for example, in Pakistan, is when the social safety net program for the poorest 20% of the population required that it be given to the female head of the household, but also that she have identification. We saw an increase in 94% in just 4 years after that of female enrollment. So I think linking to the demand side, the other is also just intentionality about inclusion and avoiding marginalized groups. So for example, in India, where it's for all residents, not necessarily linked to citizenship. And so you see that you then have a proof of identification that can be given to any resident, and whether or not you actually have a citizenship, which deals with the issues of statelessness. So I think the leadership linked to demand side uses, having a very intentional, inclusive approach. We also see in Peru where they were very intentional about reaching marginalized groups. And then I think we just all need to think about both public and private models. There's no single approach to this, and I think it's this ecosystem approach, because I don't think we're going to achieve this in any single model.
Okay, folks, I think we have to end it here. I know the panel next door ended a number of minutes ago. We went about 10 minutes over. Thank you all for attendance, and let's give her a round of applause.